I'm here today with Brent Skorup. Brent, how are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me, Richard.
Yeah, glad to have you. Brent is third place in our CSPI Essay Contest on Policy Reform. For progress, his essay is called Drone Airspace, a New Global Asset Class. Brent, can you tell the audience just a little bit about yourself, where you came from, and I guess how you got interested in the regulation of airspace?
Sure. I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. I've been here 8 or 9 years doing tech telecom and increasingly drone policy. And you see this. It's not entirely clear to me why, but you see a lot of telecom lawyers moving into the drone space, and I think there is some overlap. But I'm part of that movement. My research in the last several years um, has been increasingly about drone policy and airspace policy and airspace markets.
Yeah. Okay. And so the telecom drone airspace connection, that's interesting. I didn't know about that, but there's a parallel here that makes sense. So I mean, I thought I think I liked your essay because it reminded me of University of Chicago Law School, where everything was centered around law and economics, and the idea just sort of inherently spoke to me. So can you talk about what your idea is and how we're going to make uh, uh, basically regulation make drones work better for everyone?
Yeah, I see airspace. I would say much like people viewed spectrum, decades ago. It's or say oil fields 150 years ago. We now have the technology to use to exploit this resource. And if you believe, like me, drone technologies are going to advance quickly, that there's with electrification, the emphasis on free transportation and services, that this is a large and growing market in the future, then you're going to see congestion in airspace and competition, particularly in urban areas for airspace. Um, and so, yeah, I've done a lot of spectrum policy in the past, and obviously to you and many others will see that kind of uh, imprint on my work on drone airspace. I think the analogs are very similar. It's this intangible uh, resource dominated by a federal agency that allocates it as it wishes, um, and low altitude airspace for decades has been allocated by the FAA and its predecessors to companies for free. Um, and there's been arguments for years about how you should price airspace. I don't see it happening in commercial aviation, but with drones at low altitude airspace, certainly we have this blank slate that we can apply these older models, like auctions, like leasing, and so forth. I should add, actually, we did have airspace leasing for airmail in the 1920s. For years, the federal government auctioned airmail contracts to companies, and these startup companies would bid on airmail routes, and that's how airmail got started until the federal government, really a single postmaster general, nationalized it and took it over. But that's so. Anyways, I want to avoid that problem. The problems we saw in spectrum policy and in aviation policy, um, and consider a new regime for this blank slate of low altitude airspace and drone airspace.
Yeah. So right now, you said they just give it to company. They sell them to company? How do they decide who gets what? And so like
Uh,
airspace is like, okay, so you want from my house to somebody else's house, and then it's a certain altitude. It's like just it's like property, but it's in three dimensions, right? So you could have airspace. You could have airspace like you could have one on top of the other, right? You could have something this high and this something this high. People on the podcast can't see what I'm doing with my hands, but basically, it's just three dimensions. You're carving it up in a certain way, right? And how do they give that space out now exactly?
uh, so right now, the rules on drone operations are very strict in the U.S. I mean, they're trying to liberalize them, um, and in time they will. But the rules right now, like generally speaking, you cannot fly beyond the line of sight of the operator. Um,
Oh, really?
uh, and so that just really limits. You can't fly over people. You can't fly at night. I mean, generally speaking,
So if Amazon
um,
has a drone, they want to deliver you stuff, you just can't do that because nobody's watching it.
they can do it if I mean, and there are companies testing, and sometimes they get waivers from the FAA to do things. You can't run a business on a waiver though. Um, so in short, I know Walmart, Amazon, a few other companies are testing it. Often they'll have people on a platform, or they'll have someone, you know, a few miles away, as long as it's in visual sight of somebody. And the concern is really, avoiding helicopters or, other unforeseen uh, airspace users. But it's still at an early stage. But the day will come when the FAA liberalizes its rules, when companies can manage multiple drones with a single person. There's a company, U.S. based company called Zipline. They're very active in parts of Africa, Rwanda, Ghana, and apparently they're operating one person can monitor 24 drones. They fly in automated corridors, and so at that point it becomes a service. I mean, the technology is there. Just in the U.S., they're moving very cautiously, and there's some good and not so good reasons for that.
So
But
then you're saying in some African countries that basically drone deliveries are already a thing.
yeah, it's routine in a lot of areas. The country of Rwanda, this company Zipline, according to news reports, is delivering 75% of the hospital blood in the nation of Rwanda. Um, yeah, it's really impressive. A doctor pulls up the app, says, "I need these medical supplies," and minutes later, 20 minutes later, a drone's flying overhead and parachuting a medical um, supply box onto the hospital campus. Um, and they're doing that at dozen hospitals in Rwanda and in Ghana. They're active. They've got a few.
Are
I
these
think
like
they've got
rural areas where it's the best, where it's like the only option?
yeah, rural hospital. Rwanda is a middle income country. The rural areas are don't have much infrastructure. It makes a lot of sense there. Um, and also, I mean, the reason they can do that, the U.S. is unique in that we have over 15,000 airports. Many of these are small municipal and county airports. And it almost matches every other country combined for the number of airports we have. We just have a pretty unique and complex airspace system, so they're more cautious here. Although I think you will see more drone delivery commercial programs in the next few years.
Mm, that's interesting. So explain. So how would it exactly? So how would your system work exactly? I think most people listening to this probably don't know about Ronald Coase or the Coase theorem or anything like that. So sort of explain it if you could from the beginning for people.
Yeah, so Ronald Coase was a British economist. He won a Nobel Prize, I believe, in the 1990s, in part for his work on auctions. He popularized the idea of spectrum auctions in a famous 1959 law review piece. And actually, he says he got the idea from a law student who had Leo Herzl, who was a University of Chicago law student, I believe, when he proposed this idea of auctions um, as an alternative to the existing practice at the time, where when the FCC was deciding who should get access to the spectrum, they make these very complex regulatory decisions. About technology, about who it is, about whether they have support of political supporters. And this was a very costly way of assigning spectrum. And Herzl and Coase said, why not just auction this? Spectrum is um, companies already they lease, sublease, subdivide this asset. They're treating it as property. Let's treat it as a property asset like any other. Um, and so Herzl and Coase were proposing this in the 1950s. I mean, the idea was just mocked by any expert in the field.
Why did you need why did they you said they were already subleasing, and so they were already this sounds like there was already a market there. What was the reason then you needed Coast's idea?
Yeah, there was a secondary market. So if you were a broadcast station, say in Washington D.C., you would sell your station, but bundled with that were your spectrum rights. I mean, so but the initial allocation, and that had to be approved by the FCC, of course. I mean, that's still largely how it is today for stations. But there were these secondary market. Yeah, essentially your station was bundled with your spectrum access, and you could sell that. But the initial allocation and any new allocation, I mean, this was the issue. You had new technologies like broadcast TV at the time, um, and the government, the FCC, was just giving away this valuable resource to politically connected companies and people. Um, and also, I mean, just deciding what technology to use. Um, this was all at the national level, and you had huge lobbying fights over which technology to select. And Herzl and Coase said, this is insane. This is a spectrum is a commodity. It's undifferentiated. You just auction off to the company, let them make the technology selection within the band that they own. And the market will converge on a solution. Um, and it was a brilliant idea, but it just the nature of government, it didn't get adopted until 40 years later. Particularly with cellular phones in the 1980s, you saw cellular telephony start to gain commercial adoption, but they were still doing this very costly administrative proceedings about who gets spectrum. They actually they had so many applications to use this. I mean, cellular in the 80s was this really, really hot technology. Um, they did a lottery. I mean, they had, I believe there's a story, the FCC had a warehouse that just full of lottery submissions. I mean, there were these lottery mills to get a filing to gain it free access to these new spectrum bands for cellular, and at that point, economists, the FCC, and others were looking for an alternative way, a more fair way to assign this very valuable federal asset, this federal property, and some economists within the FCC started operationalizing this idea of spectrum auctions, which again was deeply unpopular for decades, but with cellular in the 80s, they were like, we need a new way. We need a fair way of doing this.
Yeah,
And
if
it
I
was
recall
kind of
correctly, in your essay, the story of cell phones is pretty amazing. The cell phones, if I gather, could have been basically we could have had regular cell phone use, normal cell phone use for the mass public decades earlier, if regulations had been different. Is that right?
Yeah, the first use of a mobile telephone system was in 1946. I mean, these were large primitive systems at the time in cars, but they were mobile telephone systems in cars in the 1940s. But you were stuck in this time of FCC allocations, and also you had the AT&T national monopoly, which is where uh, 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 was the national phone monopoly. So you had a single regulator and a single monopoly deciding how to use this, and they clearly did not see the potential for mobile telephony at the time, and so it just sat with AT&T for decades. There was no competitive pressure. You had some kind of ancillary services like walkie-talkies and so on, but yeah, because you had a single regulator and a single monopolist deciding what to do with this very valuable technology, it just didn't go anywhere. AT&T didn't infamously didn't really see the value of it. Yeah, McKinsey consult and predict what would the mobile phone subscribership look like 20 years in the future. They did this in the 80s, and McKinsey estimated only 1 million subscribers ever, and they were way off, obviously. But we didn't learn that until we had this system of auctions and liberal rules for spectrum use, which didn't come about until the 1990s. And so, to bring it back to drones, I see a similar phenomenon happening where we have a single regulator gifting low altitude airspace to selected companies, to favorite companies. And I think, much like telephony, mobile phones, it will just be stagnation. It'll be politicized. It'll be a few. It'll just be dominated by insiders, and politically connected, which they can do good things. I mean, these are well resourced companies with intelligent people running them, but it does not match what you can do when you have a competitive process for assigning this very valuable resource, whether spectrum or oil fields or wind energy sites. I mean, all these things are auctioned by the federal government or
Yeah.
leased.
So the oil fields started the same way. There would be oil, and then they would just basically give it to somebody, or that's what they did. It was just basically some kind of random politically connected
Yeah, so I
process.
think for the energy sector, offshore oil sites are it's complicated, but in essence, the offshore oil sites are owned by the federal government, and they lease them to companies, and the federal government gets royalty payments from it. So that's another model. It could be a lease with a royalty payment.
Was
Um,
the change on the cell phone, the spectrum, the policy, was that did that just came from internal to the FCC? Was there any pressure from Congress or the presidency or anything like that?
my reading of the history and talking with some of the people who were behind it, it was largely internal. It was economists within the FCC looking for, again, just a better way. I mean, the way they were doing it was just a huge administrative problem, and deeply unfair. And So, as I understand it, it was largely internal. Congress, in the early '90s, um, and I believe it was the start of the Clinton administration. I mean, so you had kind of free market Democrats in Congress in the presidency. So it was a popular idea. It was a bipartisan idea in 1993 when they codified it. This idea of spectrum auctions, but it literally sat on the shelves as an idea for decades, before just pragmatic concerns forced the FCC to find alternatives.
Interesting. So it was a popular idea, but it just seemed like nobody in Congress, cared enough to actually do anything, and that it was all just internal in the FCC process.
Well, I suspect. I mean, I suspect for decades, no one in Congress even knew of the idea. I mean, unless you're deep in the weeds of telecom policy, and again, even the experts at the time, um, there's a great statement. I think the FCC had Ronald Cosin as an expert to talk about the idea, and one of the commissioners said, outside of some corrupt Latin American dictatorships, they don't see how any nation would consider market pricing of this federal asset. I mean, they viewed it as this kind of sacred public property that only a corrupt dictatorship would lease off. But um, in time, obviously, and now it's a global phenomenon. I mean, this idea that began with a lawsuit in the 1950s is now how almost every nation allocates new and existing spectrum allocations.
That is a hopeful story for progress. Somebody had a good idea, it worked. They had a proof of concept, and then it spread to the world. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't
It
know
took
that.
it took 40 years. It took 40 years. So yeah, is that hopeful? Is that a tragedy? I don't know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, and it's not, and it's also not. It's not like related to sort of. It seems like not to be. Like we said, the impetus for this is not coming from from elected leaders. It just seems like this is what's specialists in sort of the policy area started to be convinced was a good idea. So with with that sort of proof of concept, why can't we get the same for drones? I mean, isn't there a record here that one could point to for which we should be doing going forward?
so this idea of airspace markets, which I've written a lot about, leasing auctions, it's seen some traction in the past couple years. I didn't. I don't think I invented the idea. I've probably written about it more than anyone else in the U.S. But I saw a paper in the last year or two from European scholars also, reaching similar conclusions that when you have congestion, when you have, say 6 companies that each want to serve, these high value corridors in a downtown area, or if we're talking about passenger drones or, you know, doing, downtown DC out to Dulles Airport, and the FAA, I should add, is they're encouraging a corridor model for this. But what happens when you have more companies than corridors? And how do you allocate it? And and the federal government's view to date has been basically we'll decide when that point comes. And I don't regard that as a good answer. That's you just get into politicized um, assignment of this very valuable asset, these corridors, whether it's drones or passenger drones. And so, I hope we can have uh, at least some people talking about this market allocation mechanism. And yeah, I should the FAA Drone Advisory Council a few years ago asked me to brief them on this. There is some interest. I mean, anytime you're talking about your government receiving revenue from an unused asset, there's some who are interested in that. So I definitely play that up, but that's kind of ancillary to the real purpose, which is if you want companies to have a competitive area and to iterate and to test, I think this is the best way forward, as opposed to this kind of centralized disposition to insiders, which I fear is, if I were placing a bet, that's where we're headed. But I think there's time to avoid that.
What is the how they, when it's not a lottery system, what is insiders, how do they justify it when they want to give it to an insider? Like, what do they say, or what do they do?
So generally, first come, first served, with some qualifications. I I'll let me talk about a little bit of history aviation, just to give an idea. So in history aviation, I mentioned there were the federal government did allow bidding to airmail contracts um, in the 1920s. In the late 1920s, some of the companies got they were sick of the competition. They started lobbying Congress to restrict competition. There were dozens of airmail companies. They got a bill passed in 1928. That didn't do enough. There were still more than 40 companies, and it took President Hoover as Postmaster General, who got some legislation passed, but then he went beyond the legislation, got the top 3 companies together, and they divided all the airmail routes between the 3 companies. So 90% of the market went to 3 companies by unilateral action by a single person. And these were, in his view, Postmaster General Brown, these were the most qualified companies. They had the best technology. I mean, so this is what I see would happen. There would be some determination about who's best positioned, but this would be a guess. And now we're living decades later with the results of that disposition of airmail contracts to 3 companies. This gave way to the big 4 airlines in time. But it's too late to put toothpaste back in the tube at some point.
Yeah, so this
I
could
mean,
have,
it's
I mean,
not
this
what I
could
want to
have
avoid.
worked for, you think if airlines had gone with an auction system from the start and not restricted competition, you think the sort of the flying would be much better than it is today?
Yeah, I do. And for anyone, I don't know if you've looked at like the slot framework in the U.S. The federal government, the FAA, allocates slots to high traffic airports. These are 15-minute increments of time that companies, that airliners use to land and take off, just to prevent congestion. These are not priced. There have, generally speaking, actually in 2011, the Obama administration took about 2 dozen slots and auctioned them off for $90 million. I mean, these are very valuable assets.
The
Um,
slot is you're renting the space and the time for landing your plane.
yeah, it's essentially airspace access at a busy airport.
So
So for a
flying into
15-minute time, yeah, I mean it's
it's
just to
just the
flavor
time,
the
or it's the space too, because they don't have only one plane landing every 15 minutes, or do they? The airports.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, so it's the airport for a given time, so that's time and space. 15 minutes at a given airport
But do you
to
get the
take
whole
off and
airport?
land.
Or is there only one per 15 minutes? That's what I'm asking.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
okay,
Yep,
so
yep.
okay, so yeah, go ahead. Okay, that's interesting.
And there's, I mean, this is an issue across around the world. Slots are very valuable, and just like Spectrum in the 1930s, there are these secondary markets. Airlines buy and sell and trade and subdivide their slots. I mean, they're very valuable, but they were given away decades ago to the major airlines. Um, and occasionally we learn their value when companies borrow against them and lease them and other things. It's we know they're valuable. I mean, and and I want to avoid that kind of dysfunction with drones that we see in traditional airlines.
Yeah. So I mean, it's like, so we don't know that like one plane per 15 minutes is an ideal way to run an airport, right? Because no matter because it's like the price system would factor in everything, which is the convenience, the convenience, the safety, the size of the airport. So it seems like you can have like many different systems. You can have like, you could have a lot of things. Is this why like you're often just sitting there waiting forever to take off? Is that related to that?
It's definitely all tied together. I mean, the thing about our airport system, and it's related to what I talked about earlier about this kind of nationalization of all air routes. But we also have a policy of, at least for major airports, these are basically they serve multiple companies. And that creates all kinds of competitive issues because Southwest wants to fly, of course, at all hours of the day, and United and Spirit and all the rest. So they're all competing for the same resource of airspace access and airport access. It didn't have to be that way. You could imagine a system of private airports, serving a single company, and you avoid a lot of these all these issues. And that's the way I see the drone industry going. I don't think you'll see this kind of forced access, this kind of forced sharing of facilities among drone companies. I mean, because there'll be drone companies doing different services. There'll be retail delivery, there'll be inspections, and so I think you will see a different infrastructure. Uh,
Have any countries gotten air travel right? Have any countries done something like an auction system and then had good or bad results with that?
no, all countries have adopted this kind of shared access regime, and just decades ago gave it had this first come first served basis where the first companies that were there have the very valuable slots, and it's very hard to uh, pull that away once they've built a business around that. Um, I will say that the U.S. is unique, not in a good way, in that most other countries have privatized air traffic control, much more private air traffic control. There's various reasons for why the U.S. hasn't done that. Um, but yeah, most of Europe has privatized air traffic control. Um, um, the Arab countries, Australia, and it just never took. So yeah, there are better models out there than what the U.S. has, but they're still a far way away from the vision I envision, which is private infrastructure and private corridors. But with drones, again, we have this blank slate to get it right this time.
Okay, yeah, and so talk a little bit about where do you think the technology is going in the near future. You mentioned shuttles from Reagan to downtown DC. How far off would say something like that be?
Yeah, it's hard to say because what's now being called the advanced aviation sector. I mean, that includes everything from piloted electric aircraft, which I think could happen in the next 5 years. Passenger piloted electric aircraft, all the way to autonomous passenger drones. I mean, that's probably at least a decade away.
Yeah.
I think you'll probably see pilot programs in the next 5 years for those, um, all the way to small drone deliveries, which there are. I used to keep track of all the drone delivery pilot programs in the U.S. I just can't anymore. There's just dozens, perhaps hundreds throughout the U.S. But I want to emphasize, none of these are commercial. I mean, these are you just can't have commercial service with the current rules they're under, which again can't fly at night. You have to have a single operator for every drone.
So what are
Uh,
they doing? Just what if they're not commercial programs?
um, I I think proof concept. They're testing their technology, testing their drones, testing their drone traffic control systems. Um, uh, yeah, I've seen some of the costs. For some of these companies. I mean, you've got to pay for like $100 per hour engineer and drone traffic managers to deliver like coffee cups and diapers. I mean, you just can't have profitable service doing that. I think for small drones, I think the first business opportunities will be largely in rural areas, medical deliveries. Kind of like the Rwanda example, but hospital deliveries in rural areas, business to business, perhaps car parts, um, that sort of thing. It's got to be somewhat lightweight but high value uh, things. Um, there's inspections, drone inspections. I think you're seeing a lot of it. Saw Korean Airlines. They with 4 drones, they could do in 4 hours what it took 10 hours for people to do. This inspection of aircraft, crop spraying again. Crop spraying with an aerial with a plane costs like $500,000. You could do it with a $10,000 drone for much cheaper. So there's a lot of these things out there. I mean, yeah, I don't know, which of these will prove to have a market. We see some of this in other nations, um, but until the FAA allows routine drone flights, you really can't have business. But we will get there, and I want my idea for airspace markets um, to be ready and to be operationalized when we do get to the point where you've got again multiple companies that want to do, say, parcel delivery in a downtown area. How do you decide who gains access to the airspace?
So are you optimistic? You sound like you think the we're going to get the policy right, or do you think we will?
Yeah, again, it depends how you view the Herzl story. This 40 years from idea to a global phenomenon. I'm optimistic that I can do better in 40 years. That this idea of airspace markets can be adopted faster in 40 years. Will it take 10? Will it take 20? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think we
Well,
will get there because
it could be like airplanes too, right? Where that we never, we got stuck in a not very good system.
yeah, it could. Um, but I've seen enough interest in other nations talking about the idea that I think this could have legs, but
Interesting. So
time
you
will
think
tell.
somebody else will do it if we don't, and then they'll sort of prove how great it is.
Yeah, I think that's totally possible. I
Which
mean,
countries do you think, which countries do, as far as you know, are looking most at this?
I've seen uh, I've seen the European regulators talk about this idea of airspace markets. It's possible they have much more familiarity with privatized air traffic management. I think they're much more comfortable than many in the U.S. Frankly, with this idea of a more private aviation system. Um, but it could be a Latin American country. Yeah, I really don't know. But I hope the U.S. will lead on this. I mean, everyone does look at the U.S. for aviation policy, and what happens here is very influential.
Yeah, America matters a lot. I mean, if you observe sort of what the rest of the world does, I think you learn that very quickly. Okay, well, I mean, it's great talking to you, Brent. Do you have anywhere where people can find you? Do you have a Twitter, a blog you'd like to promote? Anything before I let you go?
Yeah, my Twitter handle is you can find me at B Skorup. A lot of drone and technology talk. And again, I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center. You can see my latest research about drones and spectrum and telecom there.
Okay, very good. Yeah, and we'll post links to all that. All right, Brent. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Richard.